So welcome to our presentation, Analyzing Syria's Transition in the Aftermath of the Assad Regime. My name is Bob Datz. I'm a member of the program committee here at the Center for Global Justice. As much as the fleeting consciousness in some developed societies treats Syria as just another flavor of the week, it's anything but when we consider the magnitude of its struggles for democracy. It was pivotal in the Arab Spring of 2011, and some of the greatest martyrs to democracy were unfortunately lost in the streets of their own country. Once again, it was Syria where the seemingly sudden fall of Bashar al-Assad and his autocracy late last year it was widely seen as a game changer in the region. 3 months later, the power politics within the region and outside nations' level of influence have indeed shifted as Syria struggles to move forward. We know hopes have been run high in Syria in the past, only to be disappointed. So where is Syria heading now? Our speaker today is Omar Dahi, professor of economics at Hampshire College in Massachusetts and founding director of Security in Context, a research network of peace, conflict, and global affairs. He's published in academic outlets such as the Journal of Development Economics and Applied Economics, Southern Economic Journal, Political Geography, Middle East Report, Forced Migration Review, and Critical Studies on Security. His last book was South-South Trade and Finance in the 21st Century, Rise of the South or a Second Great Divergence, co-authored with Firat Demir. Professor Dahi serves as an associate editor of the Review of Social Economy, as well as the e-zine, and I hope I'm pronouncing this closely correct, Jadaliyah, and has served on the editorial committee of the Middle East Report. He's a founding member of the Beirut School of Critical Security Studies within the Arab Council for the Social Sciences, and he served as a lead expert on the United Nations Economic and Social Commission of West Asia's National Agenda for the Future of the Syria Program. Professor Dahi was born in Syria, raised in Syria, and currently lives with his wife and 2 children in Amherst, Massachusetts. The Center for Global Justice welcomes you and looks forward to some insights that we have long awaited on Syria. So thank you, Omar, and it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be speaking with you. I'm going to be speaking for about half an hour to 35 minutes. Looking forward to having as much time as possible for discussion, Q&A, your thoughts as well. So as you mentioned, my background is that I was born and raised in Syria. I've been living in the U.S. for quite a while, but I came to the U.S. In Amherst, where I am now, but I came to the U.S. in 1996. And have been living here since, but with constant connections to Syria that have been there throughout. I also study the political economy of the Middle East and have been really active in the past 14 years in various aspects of the conflict in Syria in terms of academic research, starting with a research grant on the kind of displacement crisis, the refugee crisis in the aftermath of the conflict, particularly in the neighboring countries, Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan, which it's most acute in terms of needs and in terms of kind of living conditions. But also on the policy level with the United Nations program that I mentioned. I also visited Syria for the first time in 14 years, just last week. So I'm fresh back from visiting the country and had not been able to go for a variety of reasons since the start of the uprising, which turned into a war, as you know. I always say that Syria was an unknown before 2011 and then became kind of overdetermined. And what I mean by that is that prior to the uprising, really even into the late 2000s, particularly outside of Middle East studies circles, there was little knowledge production about Syria in Europe, in the West, and elsewhere. It was not, you could count on a handful of people who could, who have written major works on Syria, at least in the kind of Western world in the English language. There's a lot more in French and German, perhaps because of the kind of the history of, Orientalist, what's called, the classical Orientalist kind of schools of thought in Germany and France. And then after 2011, Syria became overdetermined in the sense that everyone kind of had an opinion about it. So it was kind of funny to move from a topic where hardly anyone knew anything about Syria to everyone having a very strong opinion about it, which is great. I mean, it's in many ways it's totally fine, but it was amusing as someone who studies and who's from Syria to see that shift. After 2011, it became implicated in kind of discussions within the left about U.S. imperialism and the nature of U.S. imperialism and the role of the U.S. in Syria. It became involved in discussions on multipolarity and, are we seeing the new kinds of conflict or new kinds of, contestations happening that are not really totally reflecting what was kind of the moment of U.S. hegemony in the kind of post-Cold War period, even discussions about the global war on terror and so on. So what I'd like to do is to kind of lay out a few things that I think might be helpful in understanding the context. But of course, you might be following, some of you closer than others. So I'm really happy to go in the direction that you like when we get to the discussion period. So to start from the very immediate, what has happened in the last few months? So basically in the last few months, as you probably know, on December 8th, 2024, the Bashar al-Assad regime collapsed under a kind of lightning attack led by a group called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is an armed group that had until that point been located mostly in the northwest of Syria, in the province or governorate, as we say in Syria, the province of Idlib, which historically was one of the poorest provinces in the region, and which had basically become, throughout the conflict, a place where all the armed groups that had been defeated by the regime and Russia and Iran in the conflict, they had kind of corralled them to that spot. Basically, the regime had mostly won the military conflict against its adversaries in various ways, and they signed truce agreements. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second. They signed truce agreements, and basically all the armed groups who refused to kind of reintegrate into Syrian society and give up their weapons were allowed to go to Idlib in the northwest. And there were a bunch of armed groups that were consolidated by this group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, who led the offensive against the Assad regime. And since then, the leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, Ahmad al-Shara, his previous name his nom de guerre was Jolani, or someone who is from the Golan in Syria, which has been invaded by Israel, and also, there's been further incursions there. He appointed himself and kind of the armed groups that brought him to power, appointed him as president of the transitional period in Syria. Since December 8th, there's been a series of steps that they've taken. For example, they've initiated a one-day national dialogue. They have declared just on March 3rd, I believe, or sorry, in March 1st, I believe 2 days ago, they declared a charter committee that's going to write a transitional constitution or transitional charter for Syria. And they have taken a lot of steps to consolidate their power in the country. Just in terms of basically the status quo in the country, we have this transitional government, this de facto government in power, and the country is still in many ways politically fragmented. So the government controls or the current government controls all of central Syria up to the northwest of the country, while the northeast of Syria is still, that is all territories east of the Euphrates River is controlled by a group called the Syrian Democratic Forces, which includes many groups, but is largely consisted of the leadership of Kurdish political and military and security units. And they're backed up by a number of U.S. troops. So there's a kind of a de facto U.S. Presence slash occupation in the north east of the country. And then in the south of the country, there is a number of armed groups that have semi-autonomous, condition from the government. So Syria is still very much politically fragmented. It's a country with very penetrated sovereignty. The transitional government has been initially welcomed, I think, by many Syrians, particularly those who are opposed to Bashar al-Assad, particularly by the wide majority of people who felt that the status quo was untenable. But they have increasingly shown signs that they are really interested in simply in consolidating their own power and are not really doing the proper steps to kind of consolidate or to kind of include people in this transitional process. So how did we get here, and how can we understand all these changes that are happening in Syria, and what does all this imply? So what I thought I'd do briefly is to go over the kind of the history of the country, leading up to the 2011 uprising, a little bit about the uprising itself, and then kind of lead us back to where I started off with to kind of talk about it more. So as many of you probably know, Syria has been led by what's called the Ba'ath Party since 1963. The Ba'ath Party is one of the parties that emerged from the radicalization and the politicization of the Arab region in the aftermath of the 40s and 50s and the establishment of the State of Israel, which basically gave a boost to Arab nationalism, or the idea that the Middle East, North Africa countries that have kind of common language and history and culture should be united in some way, either territorially united or kind of have a common purpose or have a common kind of political future. There were many Arab nationalist parties. The Ba'ath Party was one of those Arab nationalist parties. Syria unified with Egypt under Jamal Abdel Nasser in 1958, which is an extraordinary post-colonial feat as far as I'm concerned. So Syria gained its independence in 1946, and there was about 12 years of kind of various political turbulence. But the rise of Arab nationalism within Syria basically the Syrian president at that time, Shukri Quwatli, basically went to Jamal Abdel Nasser and said, basically, we want to unify with Syria, partly to resolve some deep internal conflicts that they couldn't manage. Basically, the Syrian political elite in that time could not agree on a mode of rule, so they found a solution in essentially unifying with Egypt under what was called the United Arab Republic. Nasser then initiated a series of reforms which would set the groundwork for the next 20 years, which is nationalization, land redistribution, kind of state socialist reforms. The unity with Egypt only lasted 3 years until there were some conservative army people allied with the former oligarchy, so to speak, seceded from the union. But only 2 years after that, the Ba'ath Party came to power. They did not reunify with Egypt. They chose to kind of implement their own brand of Arab nationalism that was distinct from Nasser and consolidated power. And the Ba'ath Party was in power from basically March 8th, 1963 to December 8th, 2024. Within the Ba'ath Party, Hafez al-Assad came to power essentially in 1970, so 7 years after the Ba'ath Party itself came to power. And he consolidated power by essentially maintaining the state socialist infrastructure while accommodating to some of the internal private sector in Syria, and also importantly by mending fences with the conservative Gulf Arab countries like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, from whom he started receiving significant amount of aid. So that was the economy, the kind of political structure. Syria was characterized by extreme centralization of power. So some people have basically observed that the closest analogous kind of regime was East Germany under the communism, basically in terms of the kind of state apparatus, in terms of the party and kind of security networks, the de facto impunity of the state security, what was called the mukhabarat or the intelligence networks in Syria, and various ways in which essentially the president had control of all three branches of government, not just de facto, but de jure under the 1973 constitution. By the time Bashar al-Assad came to power, a lot of the main sources of wealth that the government had, both in terms of the oil wealth, of which Syria owns some of them, but also kind of the foreign aid that was receiving from the other Arab countries, were drying out. And essentially, his time period was characterized by an attempt to solve that. There was kind of a series of economic problems that Bashar al-Assad, the president who just fled, attempted to solve the economic problems and the political problems by initiating political and economic reform. The political reform was very short-lived, and after maybe a year and a half of relaxation, of allowing civil society to kind of hold independent meetings, to kind of have a free press, new newspapers and journals and so on were being formed, there was a severe crackdown, and most of the participants were basically accused of working for foreign embassies and the West to overthrow the government. And then he continued with economic reform, but the economic reform that took place was very neoliberal and very predatory. It essentially was monopolized by a small group of well-connected people to the government. Even the economic networks that the father had mentioned, where he kind of opened up the space for the private sector, those spaces were closed down into very small networks that were highly predatory, highly extractive, that essentially did not allow any major economic initiative to pass without essentially kind of some of the upper circle having a finger in the pie. Now, at the same time, due to its history, due to its kind of the nature of and the structure of its regime and alliance, the Syria was positioned in opposition to the US axis. So Syria became part of what was called the resistance axis sometimes, which is Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah. Up until 2011, this axis or this alliance also to some extent included Turkey and Qatar, not in terms of organic alliance, but in terms of the fact that Turkey and Qatar were both kind of pro-Western in various ways, but trying to carve an independent foreign policy from the West. This would not last. After 2011, that changed, but there was that kind of emerging axis on one hand. On opposition to that, there was the rise of an anti-Iranian axis, which included a lot of the Gulf countries and also Israel, who basically saw in Iran as a big threat to their security. And so you had what was called a kind of Middle Eastern Cold War between the resistance axis on one hand and the kind of anti-Iranian axis on the other. And this Cold War would manifest itself in the Syrian conflict. So when the Syrian uprising happened, which was basically an uprising in 2011, which I was lucky to be able to kind of visit Syria at that time. That was the last time I was able to visit the country before I went back last week or a week and a half ago. It was a mass uprising like many of those who took place in Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and so on. Not exactly the same. Each country has its own kind of specificity, but there was a pretty severe crackdown on the uprising, but also slowly it became kind of transformed from an uprising into an armed conflict, into a civil and proxy conflict, where that kind of fight over the resistance axis and the anti-resistance axis came to bear. So Qatar and Turkey, while initially sympathetic somewhat to the resistance axis before 2011, turned against Syria and essentially funded armed opposition groups to the government. And so did United States, so did Europe, so did Saudi Arabia and other countries. So that was part of the kind of proxy war that took place in the country. This also unleashed thousands and thousands of militias and armed groups, some of whom had quite an extreme exclusive ideology that was highly sectarian in terms of its rhetoric, in terms of its religious and kind of political rhetoric, that alienated a lot of Syrians. So between 2012 and 2014, there was a real descent into a hellish landscape in Syria where lots of militias were fighting each other. And then you ultimately saw the rise of ISIS itself, which was something that came in the aftermath of the fall of the Iraqi regime and the dissolution of the Iraqi army. That triggered Russian and US intervention. And you saw this de facto political fragmentation of the country where Russia and Iran consolidated their rule in some areas. The US consolidated its kind of hold in support of its allies in the northeast, and you had the kind of de facto political fragmentation of the country. So I would characterize the last 14 years into three stages. The first stage is the civil war itself, which had many stages within it, but basically the armed conflict, which you could say from mid to late 2011 till 2017, 2018. And then you had the last 5, 6, 7 years where basically it was characterized as a frozen conflict. And frozen conflict essentially referred to the idea that neither Russia nor the US nor Turkey nor Iran and all the other groups that I mentioned and countries that I mentioned were interested in continuing to fight in Syria, but nor did they agree on a political solution to the conflict. So there was no armed combat, and economically the country was deteriorating. Socially, there was more migration trying to happen outside the country. But they had attempted to freeze the conflict until when, we don't know. During this period of time, during the years of the frozen conflict, the Syrian regime had essentially won over its adversaries. Most of the armed groups were defeated and kind of, as I mentioned, kind of corralled into this area. At the same time, we've had, given the fact that I mentioned Syria has been always outside the US orbit, we've had sanctions against Syria that have been quite devastating. And actually, the sanctions against Syria predate the conflict. So I was born in 1978. The sanctions against Syria from the United States in some form started in 1979. So throughout my whole lifetime, there's been some form of way in which essentially the United States has waged economic warfare against the country. So a lot of the Syrian people really had to struggle between the kind of a rock and a hard place, between the fact that there was this Western kind of economic warfare against it, but also they were stuck with a severely repressive authoritarian government that would not reform. And here's where the biggest failure of the government happened over the last few years, which is that after it had won the armed conflict, it did not really undertake any initiative to change the political situation. So it almost accepted the frozen conflict, accepted the political fragmentation of the country, it accepted the fact that living standards were deteriorating. It didn't try to reconcile with the opposition, even though it could have done so on quite favorable terms. So, for example, Russia and Turkey and Iran created a parallel political process to the United Nations process that was stalled because the US would kind of veto any reconciliation with the government. So they created a parallel process that essentially didn't ask the government to do much other than cosmetic changes to perhaps rewrite the constitution to make it more inclusive, to perhaps include some of the opposition in the government, essentially something that would allow it to declare victory and would allow all those countries, including Turkey, to say, okay, there's a new era, there's a transitional kind of stage, and now we can kind of send the refugees back from Turkey, and all the countries who had problems with the government could kind of solve them. The government under Bashar al-Assad even rejected those minimal changes. There were credible reports that the president of Turkey, Erdogan, had been pressing Russia to hold a meeting with Bashar al-Assad for the past year, but Bashar al-Assad refused. Basically, Erdogan wanted to solve lots of issues, and one of them was the number of Syrian refugees, which had increasingly created backlash in Turkey, and also the political conflict with Kurdish political movements. But Bashar al-Assad refused. So this kind of refusal reopened the door for the armed groups in Idlib to get reorganized. And when the offensive happened in late November of last year, it was evident how much the Syrian army and Syrian society that had backed Bashar al-Assad had completely lost faith in him. Army did not want to fight. They melted away from Aleppo, which shocked us. I mean, it was completely stunning to anyone who was closely following that the Syrian army who had been stationed in Aleppo, which is, in case kind of you didn't know, it's Syria's second biggest city. Syria is unique, or it's unusual in especially developing countries, that the capital city is equal in size to the second largest city. Usually there's the capital city and then a much, much smaller second largest city. But Syria and Aleppo are kind of roughly equal in size. Historically, Aleppo is much more important under the Ottoman Empire. It lost its kind of prestige under the last kind of 75 years, but it's still a sizable city. And they kind of gave up that city without a fight. That essentially signaled that the army is not going to fight. And in the dark of the night, Bashar al-Assad, having essentially implicated the entire country and the entire region in a war simply for his own survival, then fled. And the fact that he fled without a final stand further delegitimized him in the eyes of his supporters, because essentially he left them to face their fate and kind of ran away. So the kind of the lack of a final stand, which I think is a good thing because it avoided more and more bloodshed among Syrians, meant that Syrians were aware that we need to turn the page and move on. And so they were willing to give the new government the benefit of the doubt, despite the fact that the new government has a terrible record on human rights. And I'm talking about the de facto group that held power. It's classified in the West as a terrorist organization, and many Syrians might consider it a terrorist organization, but the way it's viewed by Syrians is not exactly the way it's viewed by the West, nor should it be. Basically, they're not seen as, even though there's non-Syrians among them, but it's seen as Syrians who kind of overthrew the regime. So this is not seen as, let's say, the Iraq, U.S. toppling Saddam in 2003. Even though, as I mentioned, there was plenty of foreign interference and still remains in Syria, but at least the perception of the final act of the government wasn't that it was a foreign power toppling, but a kind of a local group that many Syrians do think is legitimate and should be part of the government. What most Syrians don't think is that they should be the only part of the government. So part of the struggles now is that this group is seemingly intent on doing the bare minimum to relieve pressure against it publicly and internationally and domestically, to essentially consolidate their power. So a lot of their decisions have been kind of unilateral. They've appointed only they've appointed only people from Hayat Tahrir al-Sham to the interim positions, even though they call them interim positions, but they're doing significant structural changes in the administration and in kind of levels of management of different government entities that essentially reflect kind of the loyalists in power. There was a national dialogue that was announced. There was and took place kind of last week. There was a constitutional committee that was announced, as I mentioned at the beginning, but all of those have been incredibly hastily arranged and non-transparent. So as it stands at this moment, kind of fresh off the, the press as it happens and fresh off where things are at, there is a country that is undertaking a very precarious transition, a country that's economically devastated, where up to 80% of its population is in poverty and deep poverty. There's United Nations estimates that 2/3 of Syrians rely on some sort of aid to get their basic needs per day. You have upwards of 6 to 7 million people internally displaced or refugees, if not more. You have a country that's de facto territorially fragmented. It's destroyed. The energy grid, the electric grid, and the power generation grid is in not completely destroyed, but it's significantly in bad shape. So when I was in Syria, there was only 1 hour of electricity per day when I was staying, and it was cold, and basically you had to be like where you huddle around the heater and all the other rooms are cold. There's no hot water or anything like that. And that's in a relatively upscale area in Damascus. That's not even in the worst areas. So the living conditions right now are very, very difficult. And if you look at human development indicators, life expectancy has fallen, years of schooling has been massively falling. There's estimates that, if you sum the total years of schooling that Syrian children have lost over the past 14 years, it comes to 800 years of schooling, kind of if you multiply by the number of children who've been out of school. It's a very weak transition. It's a kind of a penetrated sovereignty. We've had over the past 2 or 3 weeks, further Israeli invasion of Syrian territory and a new sectarian discourse. Not new, actually, it's quite old. This was first floated by an Israeli general called Yigal Allon, who argued that Israel should create a Druze. Druze community is a kind of a sect within Islam that should create a Druze dependency. And so there's this dark clouds of fear of territorial fragmentation of the country, not de facto, but kind of de jure, or attempts to kind of permanently sever the south of Syria from the rest of Syria. So that's where we're at. There's a lot more to say, of course, but I just wanted to try my best to give this overview, and I'm sure there's lots of questions, so I'm happy to kind of answer any that come to your mind or to discuss anything that I said or anything that I didn't say.
Thank you. That's that's a whole lot to wrap our heads around, and I'm looking forward to change. We'll take questions both from the audience here at the Hotel Quinto Laredo and on Zoom. Please be mindful and concise questions, mindful that others may be waiting patiently in the time that we have available. And let's begin with a question from our live audience. Into the mic, please.
My son-in-law was likewise in Damascus last week. And of course, the country hasn't been maintained in any way. Who do you see coming to be the infusion of capital into Syria at this point?
Well, that's a very good question because speaking to people last week when I was there, it's becoming clearer, or people at least are thinking that no one is coming with an infusion as capital. So I think what the current de facto government thought that if they put on a good show and they show how moderate they are compared to kind of their designations in the West, and they kind of assure everyone that their path is going to be inclusive and so on, that sanctions against Syria would be lifted, and that there would be an inflow of capital primarily from the Gulf, realistically, the countries that can fund Syrian reconstruction that have that capital is the US, Europe, or the Gulf states, right? The US is not about to do it. And I think this has been clear that the signals coming from the Trump administration is that they will not lift the sanctions. And in fact, are increasingly, despite welcoming the fall, of Bashar al-Assad, becoming, I would say, hostile. If you look at kind of some of the last few announcements, this has coincided with Israeli uptick of violence against Syria, which is also mirroring that this is a terrorist group that has come to power, and we need to treat it as a hostile force. And as you may know, kind of Israel, when the government fell, destroyed 80% of kind of Syrian army's capabilities. Right now, the only real funding, I would say, based on my sources, is coming from Qatar, who is funding the salaries of the leadership, because they have a lot of bills to pay in terms of the salaries of the president and the kind of, the foreign minister and the kind of the top echelon of kind of civil servants. But the question is, will there be more funding forthcoming? And I think it's very tentative. I think the EU is trying to ease the sanctions a little bit, and they have eased the sanctions. To what extent are they willing to completely break away from the US? Usually they essentially follow what the US says and kind of follow what the US lead on this. But, over the past few days, we've seen the kind of a fallout on Ukraine. To what extent that will reflect on Syria? I mean, I think a lot of Syrians see positives and negatives in this. Whatever happens in the Ukraine, that the most negative is that there may be a deal between Trump and Putin on Ukraine, that one of the expenses of that will be kind of Russia completely sort of forgetting about what happens in Syria, right? So to answer your question more concisely, so far there's very little to no funding, and that's a worry. But I think that worry is coupled by problematic decisions that the government itself is making. The government that has come to power is very much free market ideologically. They have these bizarre notions that they throw out that this is, Syria is going to be like Dubai and Singapore, kind of preposterous examples that are completely out of context and place for a country like Syria, which had a very interesting, diverse economy. So they've said they're going to make cuts to the public sector, they're going to free trade, and so on. So there's this kind of liberalizing neoliberal mindset that I think is going to be extremely harmful. So there are ways to mobilize domestic kind of savings and the economy to some extent, but ultimately there's also a need for significant foreign aid, and so far it's not coming.
We have another couple in the house here.
What about the UAE?
Excuse me, we have other people. Yes, you need to be heard, but we have someone else.
Actually, what I wanted to ask is related to her questions too.
Okay.
Is there a discussion going on with the Arab states? I mean, they got together very quickly recently to tell Trump they were not going to accept the exile of all the Palestinians. Have they had any urgent sessions to discuss how they're going to aid Syria? I mean, there may be some resentment there because Syria was a good partner with Iran. Iran's got a whole lot of fallout to take with this change of regime. But what's the Arab states? What are they discussing this as far as aid or anything?
Yes. So there's been a significantly positive reception from the Arab states, and the de facto, I keep saying de facto because to me, they don't have still the proper legitimacy to call them just the foreign minister, but the de facto foreign minister of the new government has been meeting with all their regional counterparts, so to speak, except for Israel and Iran. But they even met with Russians, Turkey, Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and so on. And there's been a kind of acceptance of the legitimacy of the new government or the transitional period. There's been significant discussions happening on all sorts of issues that are of concern. So a significant kind of illegal drug trade had kind of mushroomed over the past years that the previous government had tacitly allowed or encouraged or even directly benefited from. But that has not resulted in the unlocking of massive aid. So there was a pre-donors conference that took place in Brussels. The pre-donors conference, I forget now the date of that. Maybe someone can look it up, or I can kind of look it up. But this happened, I would say, late January, early February, to kind of signal the preparation for potentially a donors conference. And the representation there from the US side was very low. It was kind of, we're not interested in any of this. And that itself sent a signal. So the Arab states are eager to legitimize the government, but they have multiple things. To what extent are they willing yet to rally and confront the US on Syria remains to be seen, because they have to make up their own minds vis-a-vis the new government too. I mean, they are against the Assad regime, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're gonna, aside from Qatar and Turkey, who have fully embraced the new government, they're still hesitant to embrace it. So Qatar has, the Emir of Qatar himself flew to Syria to meet the new president. So that's the kind of highest possible recognition when, the Emir himself goes. They've renovated the Syrian airport. So I flew out of the Syrian Damascus airport when I came back to the US through Jordan. So all of those kind of the signs of kind of sovereignty and recognition and so on are happening within the Arab states. But that has not yet translated yet to a concrete kind of aid plan.
Another question in house? And do we have anyone waiting in Zoom? Okay, thank you.
Okay. You mentioned earlier something about the Syrian constitution, and I wonder if you could elaborate on that. Is there a serviceable constitution right now? Is there a constitution that could be amended and fixed? Or is there a need to maybe scrap the current constitution and hold a convention to create a new constitution?
Yeah, that very question is a topic of heated debate within Syrian society and civil society on the constitutional declaration. So the main constitution that was in operation in Syria up until the start of the uprising in 2011 was the 1973 constitution that I referred to in my remarks, which was a Ba'ath Party constitution. So the Ba'ath Party was mentioned in the preamble as the leading engine of history that's going to kind of carry the kind of Arab countries towards unification. It essentially basically provided, like I mentioned, de facto and de jure extreme centralization of power in the hands of the president and all three branches, and also gave impunity. There was legal de jure impunity to the security services that basically said that the security forces, only the head of the security services can prosecute the security services. And the head of the security services was appointed by the president, who was kind of immune from any prosecution. That constitution was rewritten in the aftermath of the uprising. So one of the concessions that the government made was that it convened a committee to rewrite the constitution, but the committee it convened itself consisted of its allies. There was no real inclusion of the opposition. So they created a new constitution that removed the Ba'ath Party from kind of the preamble and from, the the inside the Constitution, it said that the Ba'ath Party is the leading party of society, and no other parties other than a few other allies were allowed. And but nevertheless, still kept the what I would say is an extreme centralization of power, and also lack of really any freedom of speech and assembly, and kind of real guarantees for civil and political rights. And what some Syrians have proposed is going back to what is referred to as the 1954 constitution, which was the only constitution that was approved by a national referendum, and that was under what was called in the imagination of Syrians as the democratic age. So the period between the kind of a declaration of independence in the late 40s and 1958 is viewed by some in the opposition as the golden age of democracy in Syria, because Syria had a free press, it had free political parties, democratic elections. Critics of this idea see this as the oligarchic age, because basically Syria was also extremely uneven. It was ruled by notables who kind of were big landowners and so on. But that was the kind of era of the 1950s. So that was the last constitution that was seen as a freely and inclusively written, inclusive here I put it in quotes, but kind of free and kind of democratic constitution. However, there's so many articles in that constitution that are no longer relevant. So the proposal now is for a constitutional declaration that basically mentions basic principles of the new republic, around which there should be no major disagreement, such as that the Constitution is going to guarantee, the Syria is going to guarantee political and civil rights, freedom of assembly and speech, provisions that have to do with equality as citizens, rather than a kind of a sectarian balance that took place in Iraq in the aftermath of kind of the US invasion. So basic principles that will then dictate or allow the transitional phase to come in, which will write the permanent constitution of the country. That's the ideal, in my view, the ideal scenario. A declaration of principles until there is an actual process, which could take more than a year, more than 2 years, because remember, Syrians are fragmented. So actually having an inclusive process to allow people to think that they have some input about not just the constitution, but the kind of transitional phase, it takes time. And unfortunately, I don't think what's going to happen, because they just declared that there's going to be a committee that was appointed by the president, by the de facto president, to write the constitutional declaration. The committee itself is not inclusive. There was no widespread consultations. There was no attempt to include all aspects of kind of the political and social forces in the country. And I think they're going to come up with a declaration. We'll see what it is, and we'll see how people respond to it.
We have one person waiting online. We could take that question from Mark, if he could be allowed to speak.
Okay, Omar, thank you so much for your presentation and, well, the other work that you do. I had a chance to read some of your publications. I'm interested in the economic dimension of this situation. Can you talk a little bit about both the de facto government's likely position or espoused position and that of some of the other groups in terms of not even so much economic development, but economic equity and distribution of land and resources and benefits, social services, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the new government has an ethical framework. You may not agree with it, or I may not agree with it, but there is a set of. So, for example, I mentioned the electricity. So before the fall of the Syrian regime, the areas where I stayed would have had 3 to 4 hours of electricity per day. And some areas were not getting almost any. So the new government said we need to equalize that. Everyone gets 1 hour of electricity a day. And so everyone should share in the suffering equally, right? The rich areas should not get more hours of electricity, which I like in a way. I mean, I think it's fair, right? Everyone should suffer equally in the misery that is the country. Although the joke in Syria is that we don't know anyone who got more electricity. Everyone got less. Like, presumably some areas got less, others should get more, but we don't know anyone who got more. But anyway, at least at the surface, that's what they did. And I think it's a big debate in Syria right now because, as I kind of mentioned, one of the strengths of the Syrian economy was its diversity. And that is what gave the Syrian economy its resilience. Syrian economy had manufacturing and industry, some manufacturing industry. It had agriculture significantly. It had tourism. It had mineral production and extraction. Oil, natural gas, and phosphates are the primary one. It had cash crops like cotton. It had citrus. It had wheat and barley. It had textile manufacturing and pharmaceutical manufacturing that essentially covered 90% of Syrian consumption of basic medicines. It had tourism, so it was a very diverse economy, and I think that's what allowed it, despite the catastrophes of the war, to be resilient. And I think this is a disaster if we kind of move away from that. If we move to kind of the neoliberal kind of, building mega tourist sites and hotels and this kind of, this is very, what's sometimes called the Gulf model or giant malls and so on. And needs to rely on the traditional source of strength. And I think there are those within the government, because they come from rural backgrounds and not from the city, who know the importance of agriculture, as opposed to a lot of the city bourgeois industrial merchant class who kind of basically thinks agriculture is just backwards and kind of, is a waste of time and so on. And not seeing agriculture as the backbone in terms of food security, in terms of self-sufficiency, and in terms of the linkages that you could establish, because a lot of the Syrian manufacturing sector had linkages. So, we processed and packaged foods and canned foods, for example, right? And textiles from cotton and so on. So there is a neglect of that cadre because they're seen as the old regime. Right. Part of the neoliberal kind of, I think this was also in kind of the Eastern European transition, is to destroy the public sector because that's how you get rid of the old regime, and you can prevent it from reviving through that. And so there is a lot of that impulse. And I think there is now, the good thing is that there's significant pushback that says we need to maintain the public sector. So the public sector now is a real problem. They've said that we're going to fire half of the civil servants in the public sector and the state-owned enterprises because there's what's called fake employment. They're using the term fake employment. That a lot of those people get salaries, but they don't do any work. They're only there. They collect paychecks, and they were politically connected to the previous regime they were appointed, which is not true. And second of all, they don't know if it's true. Like, they haven't been in power long enough to make an assessment of the public sector and understand who's fake and who's not fake. And also, even if they were all fake, public sector employment also serves as a universal basic income in Syria. So public sector employment in the regime-held areas, which are now the areas of the government, reached 50% of the workforce. So you're throwing away half the workforce without a salary is a catastrophe. Okay, it's not legitimate, it's unfair, and it's also unwise if you're trying to consolidate the transitional process, because that's, you're creating enemies immediately when you kind of do that. So I think the one good thing is that within the opposition, within trusted sources of the new government, there's significant people are telling them that A, you lack the legitimacy to do this. B, you lack the knowledge of who's fake and who's not, and it's not necessarily true what you're saying. And C, it's unwise to do it, even if all of those things were true. And this is should be left to a previous, like there should be a reform of the public sector, I think. But that's not a process that should happen now. It should happen after and during the transition where they should assess, because some public sector enterprises, and this is true all over the world, there's this general idea that it's a losing sector. But that's not why the public sector exists, not to make money necessarily. But even within the public sector, they are profitable. Actually, even within the public sector, it's not all a money drain. They're actually profit producing entities within the public sector. So that's where we are right now.
Thank you.
Well, we have more in-house questions. Lulu has got a beat on who's had their hand up.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. I have a question that sort of harkens back to the Arab Spring, because we know that everywhere that authoritarian Arab regimes came under threat from mass movements from below, we saw the creation of new community-based forms of organizing, community groups, and so on. Many of those were utterly repressed in the decade since the Arab Spring. And I'm wondering during your visit whether you saw any sense that, first of all, there is some memory in the community of that previous round of struggle, and secondly, the regeneration or replacement of the kinds of community organizations that were built during the Arab Spring. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely, fantastic questions and really spot on. Yeah, I mean, it's also, so I was in Damascus mostly. So I'm gonna, I don't want to exaggerate the knowledge I gained from this visit compared to kind of looking at the overall situation. And the view in Damascus is different from the view in Aleppo, different from the view in other places. And I think it's important to keep in mind. But in Damascus right now, there is a real politicization of the city that I haven't seen ever. I mean, growing up, it was, political dialogue was suffocated other than just applauding, publicly applauding the regime. And so there are all these listservs on WhatsApp and daily lectures, daily discussions. There are groups that are talking about the economic transition. Every single question, for example, that you asked today, and all of you, all the wonderful ideas that have come up, there have been discussions about them, the Constitution, and a lot of the strange thing, however, is that the problem of Syria was that a lot of the groups who have been doing all the thinking around those topics were exiled. They moved to Europe or to the neighboring countries, or less so to the US, but they're people who kind of moved, all over the world. And some of them have built lives there. So some of the legacy of that you mentioned has moved outside the country. And there's a really unhealthy dynamic. It doesn't quite exist fully, but to some extent it does, in the sense that, well, everyone who remained must be de facto suspicious because they're pro-regime. And I think that to some extent that does exist among the new government, that they're treating all the existing previous intellectuals, activists, journalists, economists, technocrats, and so on, who were there as suspicious because they worked for the old regime. But even outside of the exiled civil society, there have been lots of groups that have emerged quite spontaneously to carry on the memory of the kind of activism that you mentioned. So there were a lot of people who returned, a lot of people who were always there, who are, for example, documenting in various cities around Syria, like the sectarian troubles that are happening between, there's been targeting of Alawites, who are the sect to which the previous president belonged. There's been extrajudicial assassinations. there's been increasingly some kind of predatory takeover of property. It's not quite clear who's doing it. And the good thing is that the leadership, at least, is verbally condemning it, but there's also a bit of, chaotic, quite dangerous security situation in various points. So a lot of these organizations are documenting them under very, difficult conditions. So there is that regeneration, but at the same time, there's a disconnect between a lot of the major civil society platforms that emerged during that period, who have gone abroad and established themselves abroad and may not want to even return to live in Syria. There's this kind of inside outside dynamic that's happening, but that's kind of to be expected. And I think that one of the things that's happening is a reunification. This is an idea that I had while I was there. So it's a bit half-baked. I'm just going to share it with you as kind of thinking out loud, is that there's a reunification of the public sphere within the country that is healthy. So what happened during the war is that there are kind of subcultures that were created that were completely isolated from each other. I mean, in the same way we think now that, people who are MAGA Republicans talk amongst themselves, and kind of liberal Democrats talk about themselves, and the left talk, in the US. But that happened under a civil war situation in Syria, where the kind of the pro-regime people talk to each other only, and there were completely parallel realities and worlds, and the news they kind of disseminated was completely different. Now there's a gradual reunification, and so there's lots of disagreements, but people are talking about the same things. So, I see it on my social media pages because for various reasons, I have kind of people on different sides of the divide. And I see this quite interesting convergence of what people are talking about. Like they're actually referring to the same processes, even if they disagree about it. So there are quite interesting changes happening in the public sphere. Some of them picking up from the legacy of what you just mentioned. People who have what are called, what is called in this moment, revolutionary credibility, who say that to the new government, you are not the only people who sacrificed. You just kind of, you picked the fruit of the final battle, but there are a lot of people who sacrificed before you. You cannot simply become a new dictatorship, and a wide range of arguments around that.
Hopefully you have a few more minutes and we can keep this rolling, if that's all right.
Yeah, if I can go until like 10 more minutes, if that's okay.
We'll keep that in mind. Thank you.
Hi,
Pardon me? These two questions will get on the floor. Yes.
I wanted to ask you about women in the new regime. You spoke about social, I don't know how loud this is, but you spoke about, social equality in the new constitution and what would be there. But you didn't mention specifically women, which we know have been pretty much excluded from much of Arab life. And will this be taken into account, the equality, in terms of dressing, in terms of their right to speak, and sexual equality? Too big a...
Yeah. Was there another question, or should I answer that?
I think that question can stand alone, if you don't mind.
Yes, absolutely. So basically, that's another topic that is hugely contentious now, and important to kind of shed light on. And it's also complicated because, in the economic sphere, Syria had a very low female labor force participation rate. And this is something that's not just unique to Syria. You find it in Turkey. You find it in a lot of the Arab Middle Eastern countries. It seems to be an Arab Middle East phenomena, and to some extent in Turkey. It's not Islamic, so female labor force participation in other predominantly Islamic countries that are outside the Middle East is very high, or relatively higher, and on par with the global South average. And it's not among just Muslims. Among Christians in Syria, it's also been, low female labor participation rates. So, and at the economic level, you're right, there is this kind of deep structural gender inequalities that have persisted. They're even more accentuated in the rural-urban divide. So there's lots of kind of layers of kind of deep structural inequalities. There are legislative inequalities about kind of citizenship and who has the right to pass on citizenship. It was usually only males who can pass on citizenship to their kids. And you know, a wide variety of structural inequalities that civil society and feminist groups have discussed. I think one of the biggest fears by kind of feminist groups and women's groups is that the new government holds a deeply reactionary view of gender equality, of women's rights, that is one of the reasons why they see both the representation of who made the national dialogue and also the appointments of, you know, who's going to craft the the constitutional declaration that I mentioned as reflecting a kind of a highly conservative ideology that essentially will not only not advocate for more rights for women, given the status that I mentioned before, but like retrenchment of the gains in terms of just basic rights, like legal rights, and also a kind of, you know, what you also refer to as a kind of a policing of personal behavior. And I think those should be taken into account. There's kind of basic economic rights. There's all sorts of real issues that have to do with housing, land, and property rights that have come up over the past 13 years. So when we think of women's rights, as you all probably know, it's actually multidimensional. So, for example, there's been a lot of women-headed households as a result of the conflict, and a lot of these women whose partners or husbands or parents have died, the property that they lived on, a lot of it was informal property, and that was not registered officially under the kind of real estate, what's called the kind of the real estate agency, basically. And so the question is, you know, do they have the right to kind of still live in places where they were living and they were always living and they were born, land that they were born? So and in many ways the laws are, there's various interpretations of the laws that tie it to the male kind of heirs and to the male owner of properties. So the wide variety of issues under women's rights, economic, political, social, that's a real concern. And I think this is where I worry that a lot of the civil society groups who are eager to see a transition are not advocating as forcefully onto this as they should be, and that it will fall to kind of the backdrop. So even you know, it was a struggle to have a verbal declaration of verbal kind of women and men's equality in the kind of national dialogue. There was a woman who presented the final declaration. So that itself was viewed as a kind of a statement that the woman was the one who basically summed up the national dialogue. But in the pronouncements of the national dialogue, you didn't see extensive coverage of women's rights. And I think that's going to be a battle. In the cities, in the big cities in particular, the fact that, you know, cities in general, you have more diversity of social and political lifestyles and not political lifestyles, but, you know, kind of politics and social lifestyles. And so there's a degree of secularism and equality and kind of presence of women's movements that will push back against some of the most extreme kind of repression against women. But I do think that in the countryside where, you know, there's less of that capacity, in the rural areas, you do see, and again, I'm caveating all of these things to not imply that it's a homogeneous situation. So historically, there's some studies that show that women in the countryside have quite a bit of agency because they're economic producers. And they have quite a bit of autonomy because they're economic producers in agriculture, as opposed to be women in cities who have less agency because they're usually stay-at-home housewives who don't have as much economic. There's debate about this, but there's nuances in it. So there are various ways in which we can see this, but in the general thrust, you're absolutely right. It's a major concern that we need to, be worried about and hope that Syrian society can be really forcefully organized around.
And we do have our final question. Oh, okay. And that's going to be right here.
To have it. In conclusion, Omar, clearly Syria is in a honeymoon phase, much left to be determined. A cold one. My son-in-law brought in warm clothes for aunties and his mother. But when you look at the future, what do you need to see to remain hopeful for your country?
Well, in my view, I mean, I agree with you, but I would say it was in a honeymoon phase. Now the honeymoon phase is ending quite shortly, I would say, especially if things continue this way. I would say we need an economic revival because the basic needs situation, the humanitarian situation is really horrible. Kind of a gradual process where basic services, where you have, at least several hours of electricity a day, not just because people can stay warm, but also businesses, and agriculture. You need the energy infrastructure and the electric grid to be there so you can revive the economy, right? We need to de-escalate all the tensions. So there needs to be a serious dialogue between the government and Kurdish political and military groups. And I think there needs to be, and there are signs that there's an actual, chances of a compromise. Ultimately, we need to see all non-Syrian forces out of the country, US forces and Israeli forces, of course. But the US seems to be pushing in another direction. And we know now this is a moment of Israeli impunity in the West. And that has real consequences. So there has to be a gradual process. But ultimately, I think the best thing the government can do is to really trust in the fact that you have a wide range of civil society actors, activists, unions, peasant organizations, all of whom that if they allow them, if they don't treat civil society in the same paranoid way that the previous government did, can really actually be the best antidote to the countervailing negative impulses that are happening and practices that are happening. And I think that's our hope.
Well, I think the collective energy here is not to mention the substance of the questions and the discussion has been fabulous and very enlightening as I thought it would be. And I really want to thank you on behalf of everyone here in the center for a great presentation. I hope the water's not dripping on the floor, and I hope we get to speak with you again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the great discussion.